Hi, my name is Tyler, and I wanted to make a short video to give you an update on kind of where I'm at with my process as a PhD student and where I'll be heading going forward. I recently finished in May of 2025 the second year of my PhD, which really just means that I've wrapped up all my classes or required classes and electives so far for the PhD program, and now I can focus on my dissertation, which is comprised of 3 separate chapters. And basically that means there's 3 separate papers that you have to write that then get combined into one paper overall, which is ultimately your dissertation. So what I did was finish the classes end of April, early May, and then I went ahead and started on my first chapter's model, so model 1. And I started the logic behind this model back in second semester, so beginning of 2025, let's say around February. I had an idea in my head of what I ultimately wanted to do. And then once I had the logic down, which was basically in my head, and then I wrote it down on paper in terms of what I wanted to accomplish, I then came up with the code for that. And I'll make subsequent videos on exactly what my chapter 1 or model 1 is comprised of, but I don't want to give too much away right now. But what I ultimately did was develop the code in around June of 2025, and I basically had to do some code for heuristics related to vehicle routing problem, as well as some deterministic solvers. So it was pretty time consuming to come up with the code, but one thing I did do that was an advantage is I pair programmed with some AI tools, specifically OpenAI, to help me go back and forth with it to write the code. I'm still new on my coding journey, but I'm definitely learning a lot. I'd say over the summer, I wrote over 10,000 lines of code while pair programming with OpenAI, and that's been hugely beneficial. So my summer was comprised of focusing on model 1 of chapter 1, and then I ultimately took a class at MIT, which I documented the first week of that, but I spent 3 weeks at MIT in July, was able to dive into a number of different AI concepts related to logistics and supply chain. And then ultimately was back in Utah beginning of August. It's, I believe, August 21st today, so we're getting towards the end of August. But I'd say my chapter 1 is in a really good place. I have an outline of how I'm going to complete it. I have to do the runs for the code now for the experiment, and then ultimately I'll write about those results, come up with a conclusion. The literature review will take a decent amount of time, so I have to allocate some brain power to knocking that out. But ultimately I feel like I have a good grasp on chapter 1's paper to ultimately finish by November, December in terms of a draft. And there will be a lot of revisions for that, but it's definitely exciting to be like I'm executing on what I had in my proposal, which my proposal was finished. The presentation and document were finished in March and April respectively. So it's definitely very exciting. You know, as far as my process with each of these 3 chapters, I basically have the proposal done, which I finished first quarter of 2025. So I have an idea of what I want to accomplish, but there's a lot of work you have to do in terms of going from what you're thinking you want to do to ultimately developing the logic for the model, and then getting into actual code itself, then running the code, and then ultimately writing your paper, which is writing about what the results were, introduction, literature review, results discussion, conclusion, etc. So there's a lot of work involved in that. But basically what I want to outline today is that my process is coming up with the experiment or hypothesis and problem that I want to dive into, writing down the logic behind how I want to run the experiment, writing it down, taking it from what's in my head and putting it on paper, or within a Dropbox folder such as Excel file or Word doc really helps get it out of my head and get it down and help me to refine it, which then the next step is to ultimately get into where you're programming it or putting it into code to be able to be something that can be run as an experiment. And the code in and of itself takes quite a bit of time. So as I mentioned, I pair programmed with OpenAI, and even that, some of the stuff that I'm doing is really complicated with these heuristics, so it's not super straightforward. And again, I wrote so much code this summer, pair programming, that it really enhanced my learning curve. And there's going to be some concepts in chapter 2 where I'm getting into deep reinforcement learning, coming into something called OpenAI Gymnasium and Stable Baseline 3. And I'm really excited about that, to bring in the deep reinforcement learning with these heuristics and build out some models. The focus of my research is the vehicle routing problem and the traveling salesman with added constraints. So it's kind of become an obsession of mine. Routing is very combinatorially complex, so you have a number of different solutions as you increase the number of locations that you're delivering to, and also the number of delivery vehicles that you have. So it's definitely a passion of mine. I'm hoping to, I want to write these 3 chapters, but I also have plans to write more papers after. So I'll probably look at doing a postdoc or some type of role where I can continue to write some research papers. I'm a little bit undecided on what I'd like to do after the PhD program, which I'm scheduled to graduate in spring of 2027. But I'm really loving my research and learning a lot. I've been told by some it's pretty advanced. I wouldn't go so far as to say that, but it is time consuming and takes a lot of brain power to concentrate on. So really just grateful to God to be in this position, to be able to pursue this PhD and also have research that I'm really excited about. So I think the biggest takeaway of this video is that you need to have a diligent process. I'm still refining mine every day. It's almost like your brain has to shift from first gear, reading research papers, going slow, but using powerful cognitive ability with your brain, and then you're switching it into higher gears, 4, 5, and 6 when you're coding or actually running the experiments and have the code done. And writing is somewhere in the middle of that. At least this is my experience. So wanted to give you an update on where things were at. I hope to have the first chapter done by November or December. Again, just a draft of 2025, November, December of 2025, and then I'll begin working on chapter 2 in January of 2026. And one thing I'll be doing is working on model 2 for chapter 2 alongside my writing for the chapter 1. So I'll be working on that this fall as well. Then I'll get into chapter 3 probably sometime in the spring and summer and start working on that model as I'm writing chapter 2. So hopefully we'll give myself enough time to finish this degree and well within the kind of 2-year window that I have set for myself. And hopefully I can continue this research after. The deeper I go, I realize there's a number of different things that I want to dive into more and explore further, but it's just a matter of doing that. So one thing I did do was start a lab, Supply Route AI lab. I'm really excited about that. I'm just going to be posting content probably on a bi-weekly or every 3 to 4 week basis related to my research, as well as other logistics and supply chain topics. And I've got 2 years, so I want to basically put my research in an umbrella under the lab, and then maybe find folks to collaborate with at Utah or other universities down the road in terms of a postdoc or research position. So, and I can also see a company or companies being spun out of the lab. The reason I got this idea was from Google's DeepMind that a guy started from London, and Google ultimately bought it, but he was working on a number of interesting things, creating I believe it was deep reinforcement learning models against human players for games like Go and maybe even chess. And then he also worked on the protein folding problem, which I believe he won a Nobel Prize for. So that's kind of the model I'm going after. I'm very elementary version of that. So that's pretty much it for today's video. Just wanted to give you an update on where I'm at and kind of my process, and hopefully you enjoyed watching, and thanks and have a great day.